what basically plugs up the pore. And the way I've drawn it, basically you've got charges that are attracting each other. The now negative intracellular phase of the voltage gated sodium channel attracts the positive charge ball, plugging up the hole. And that's the difference between the inactivation state and the closed state. In neither case can sodium flow through. Sodium can't flow through the closed voltage-gated sodium channel, nor can it flow through the inactivated state. And just as a tidbit, which I mentioned before, this is what causes the absolute refractory period. So when is it that the inactivation state exists? It's during the falling phase of the action potential. During the falling phase of the action potential, that causes the absolute refractory period because there's no depolarization that's going to cause this channel to be able to conduct sodium through it. So this is the mechanism for the absolute refractory period, that thing, that factor that limits the rate of action potential production of a neuron to 1,000 action potentials per second or less. Okay, question? Yeah. So the question is, if I translate this correctly, what's your question? Is the inactivation state caused by the influx of sodium? No, okay. So the question was, why is there a change in the charge distribution within the protein itself? And for a specific version of the question is that because of the flux of sodium? And the answer is no. The answer is that as the protein changes from here to here, and so here's your closed ion channel. As it opens, the protein itself consists of subunits. And the subunits themselves have amino acids through them, some of which are charged and which are not. They slide against each other. So the opening isn't just a pop open like this, it's more of a sliding open. And that sliding of the amino acids within the protein itself is what causes the redistribution of charges. It's not the sodium flowing through. In fact, this will happen even if no sodium is flowing through. That's been measured. Question? Yeah. No answer to that. So the question is, does the inactivation state also include the relative refractory period? No. So the thing I haven't done yet, and this doesn't get answered later, that I ask again, right? So the question is, what causes the relative refractory period? And that's a voltage-gated potassium channel question. So that's the answer. And so then the question is, so if we're ended up in this inactivation state, how does the channel get from the inactivated state to the closed state? And the answer to that, that's actually an important question. That's non-trivial. The answer to that is that the membrane potential needs to repolarize to a value that is more negative than rest, to minus 65. Okay? And so this inactivated state will continue through the peak of the action potential down through the falling phase until the membrane potential at the end of the action potential, sorry, there's no diagram to show you, reaches minus 65 and below that level. And so this is happening, this transition is happening during the undershoot. Okay? During the time that the membrane potential is actually more negative than rest. And it's believed that that is actually one of the functions of the undershoot, is to produce this transition of the voltage-gated sodium channels from the inactivated state to the closed state. Okay? That's the voltage-gated sodium channel. Any questions before we go on to the voltage-gated potassium channel? That'll, I think, answer your question. Much simpler. Okay, so different channel, different configuration. Okay, so here we have the voltage-gated potassium channel, chloride, only two states, closed and open. Much simpler. So this again is a cross section. This is the cell membrane. This is the voltage-gated potassium channel and its closed state. This is the voltage-gated potassium channel and its open state. So what does it take to cause that transition from closed to open? It's a two-part answer. It takes two things. One, it takes depolarization. And the other thing it takes is a little bit of time. So the voltage-gated sodium channel opens almost immediately, depolarization. The voltage-gated potassium channel opens depolarization, but with a delay. Okay? So what it takes to go from here to here is depolarization plus time, roughly a millisecond or so. Okay? And that's what causes the transition from the closed to the open state, and then whenever the voltage-gated potassium channel is open, then potassium flows down its electrochemical gradient, which is almost always from inside of the neuron to outside. That loss of positively charged ion makes the makes the voltage more negative. Loss of a positive charge makes the voltage more negative. Okay. And yeah, there is a charge redistribution here within this protein as well, although the functional significance of that's pretty much irrelevant. But this is what allows the voltage change to produce the change in the configuration of the proteins themselves. It's because these voltage-gated channels are charged, that is what allows the voltage change to actually produce a force on them that causes their configuration to change. Right? That charge distribution didn't exist. Right? So if it was equal across, if the charge distribution was equal across, then voltage change wouldn't exert a force on these proteins. Machines. Interacting parts. Okay, did I answer your question about? Relative refractory period? Actually, I didn't say it. So this is basically what causes the relative refractory period, right? Because there you have this high permeability of the membrane to potassium. That's happening during the falling phase and undershoot. There, the membrane is most permeable to potassium, and so the equilibrium potential is driven toward minus 80 because the membrane is most permeable to that ion. So that's why it goes to close to minus, the membrane potential goes close to minus 80 in the undershoot, the relative refractory period. And so what's the cause then of the relative refractory period is that when the membrane is most permeable to this ion, the membrane potential wants to stay close to minus 80, making it difficult for depolarization to drive the membrane potential up to the threshold for an action potential. So that's the relative refractory period. Question? Yes?
Does the potassium when have the ball and chain?
Why does the potassium have the ball and chain? No, it's free of that. There's nothing to drag around. No more protein. Yeah. That's a structural. Okay. And so, how do we know these things? What's the evidence that for these, for these models? Well, there's a lot of it. Part of it means some of these proteins have been cloned in the amino acids in the sequence, et cetera, et cetera. But part of it comes from a particular technique, and that's called patch clamp. And I'm going to describe a little bit of a patch clamp and show you some simulated and some actual data to really help you understand the role of the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels in the production of the active potential. Okay? So here we have a kind of a description of patch clamp and what it means. So here's a neuron, and there's an electrode that's lower down to touch the membrane of the neuron. And the electrodes that we've talked about in the past have been sharp, so they penetrate through the membrane. So measure from the voltage from inside to outside. These electrodes are fire polished, so the tips are actually smooth. So basically, lower this electrode down to the membrane. This is an enlargement here. Put a little bit of vacuum on the electrode, and in the old style, this used to be literally a mouth suction. And so as a result of that, a little bit of the membrane of the neuron, so this is extracellular here, this is intracellular, a little bit of the membrane would be sucked into the tip of the electrode, and then you merely pull the electrode away from the neuron, detaching some of the membrane, a patch of membrane, hence the patch clamp. And so here you have a patch of membrane that is stuck within the electrode. And so here you duplicate the extracellular concentrations of ions, and here you duplicate the intracellular concentrations of ions. And you have this patch of membrane, and sometimes that contains a voltage-gated sodium channel, sometimes it contains a voltage-gated potassium channel, sometimes it doesn't contain any, sometimes it contains both, sometimes it contains multiples. Okay, that you can't control. Just suck a little patch. Sometimes you get one, sometimes you get the other. And so these are idealized examples where you only have one of each. Okay, so this is what you do, and then what you do is you want to see what current will flow through that single channel that you have in the patch. And of course, these are voltage-gated channels. So what you do experimentally, what you do as an experimenter is you apply a voltage. And that's what's shown up here. So this is what you experimentally apply, a voltage. So minus 65 here, a depolarizing voltage, and you hold it at a particular level, that is, you clamp it. You clamp the voltage at a certain level. So this is the patch, and that's the clamp, at a patch clamp. And then you observe the effect of that clamped depolarization on current flow through the single channel. And that's here, so this is where you have zero current flowing through, and this is when you have current flowing in, positive current flowing into the neuron. So no current, influx of current, that would be sodium flowing through the channel, and then no current. So that's one. That would be a current flow through a single voltage-gated sodium channel with a constant depolarization. And so what do you see out of this? What does this suggest about the characteristics of the voltage-gated sodium channel? Well, there's a bunch of things. So one is that the current flux, and I'm just going to call it the channel opening, right, just for simplicity's sake. The channel opening causes the current flux, which allows the current flux, is almost instantaneous. So the depolarizing voltage is applied here, you get an almost instantaneous influx of sodium through the channel. The other thing is that this is almost like a digital signal, right? It's a little square wave. Dip, dip, dip. And so what that tells you is that these channels don't slowly open, they pop open. and then the pore of the channel maintains a constant size, and then it pops closed. Because if the channel is slowly opening and slowly closing, this would be a smooth wave here. But it is a square wave. Channel pops open, pops closed. When it's open, it has a constant diameter, so there's the constant rate of sodium flowing through the open channel. And then the channel stays as closed, but you might want to substitute the word inactivated. The single event is maintain depolarization. So even though the depolarization is maintained, basically you get only a single current flow, even though you have maintained depolarization. And so here, just to kind of get to the bottom line, here is when the channel is closed, here is when the voltage-gated sodium channel is open, and here is when the voltage-gated sodium channel is inactivated. All stuck up in the board. Questions? Yes?
Does this apply to the potassium channels as well?
Does it apply to what?
Does this apply to the potassium channels as well? Popping open and popping closed?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. But we'll get to that, okay? So, what about the potassium channel? So, first, finish with the sodium channels. So, okay, so there was one event. And here is basically showing you the same kind of diagram that I showed you with my schematic drawing, a little bit more cartoon still, but a little bit more. So here you have patch clamp sodium channels, multiple channels, 1, 2, 3 channels. Here you have a maintained depolarization. Okay, so you start the depolarization here, open channel, open channel, open channel, channel almost instantaneously, typically microseconds, until the channel opens. And the channel is closed, the channel is open, and then you have the channel inactivated here, and then the channel goes back to the closed configuration. So here is closed, here is open, same thing I drew. Here is the inactivated, and then back to closed. And here you have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can match them up with what the current flow looks like. Yes.
Can you repeat the part, the clamp part of the name? What did you say about that? What are we clamping the voltage?
Oh, why is it called voltage clamp?
Yeah, that's the clamp.
Okay, so it's called the voltage clamp because what you're doing as an experimenter is you're applying a constant depolarizing voltage during this time. You're clamping the voltage. Like during an action potential, you have this rapidly changing voltage. Here, you want to see what happens with constant voltage. So, and typically what's used is -3 millivolts as the clamping value. It's just, just throw that in for free because that's a value of depolarization that will open virtually all of the voltage-gated sodium channels. You couldn't based on just the data here. Okay, so that's basically lots of experimentation using a convergence of evidence. But one of those lines of convergence of evidence is, for example, you can put in intracellular proteases that will cleave the ball off of these voltage-gated sodium channels and do the same kind of experiments, and the inactivation gate goes away. You cut that chain. And a bunch of other things. Questions? So this is just a duplication of what you just saw. So, not as well drawn. Okay, but I want to do this so that I can contrast what happens with the voltage in the potassium channel, which really haven't been shown. And it's to compare and contrast here. It's important. So this is just duplicating what I showed you before with the PowerPoint. So this is right out of your notes. So this is my attempt to duplicate a patch clamp. So here's an electrode. There'd be a voltage-gated sodium channel here. I can't really draw that in. And this is basically in an aqueous solution where the aqueous solution duplicates intracellular fluid. In here, you duplicate the concentration of the extracellular ion. Right? And then you apply a depolarizing voltage across the patch, right? The clamp, and then look at the current flow and 3 different patches, voltage-gated sodium channels each time. You get an almost instantaneous opening. It's a square wave or almost a square wave, and that doesn't open again, the inactivation gate. And I'm just doing this because now I want to show you what happens with voltage-gated potassium channels. It's very different. So basically, the technique you're applying is identical. The only difference here is that when you put the electrode down on the little membrane, instead of capturing a patch that contained a voltage-gated sodium channel, you've captured a patch that contains a voltage-gated potassium channel. That's really the only difference, is what kind of channel you capture in the patch. And you basically apply the same experimental manipulation. That is, you depolarize the membrane potential, right? Depolarization across the patch. You've duplicated the extracellular concentrations of ions and intracellular concentrations of ions. And here you apply this depolarization, but what you see happen is that nothing happens initially. There's a delay. A delay of about a millisecond. Okay? And then what happens is that you get repeated openings of the voltage-gated potassium channel as long as the depolarization is maintained. So you maintain this depolarization here, and you keep on getting these square waves over and over again. So this just gives you 3 different examples of 3 different voltage-gated potassium channels. Here, the other difference is that this is a positive deflection, and that is because you have a positive ion going from inside of the neuron, or what's the equivalent of inside of the neuron, through the voltage-gated potassium channel to the extracellular side. The electrode is duplicating the extracellular side. Right? And so this is what characterizes the differences between the voltage-gated sodium and the voltage-gated potassium channels. And these differences are critical to what forms the waveform of the action potential itself. Okay? So one is that the depolarization at the beginning of an action potential, that threshold, causes both channels to open, or back to the action potential now. So the depolarization that begins the action potential is the factor that opens both the voltage-gated sodium and the voltage-gated potassium channels. But the voltage-gated sodium channels open instantly, almost instantly. The voltage-gated potassium channels open later. But it's the same depolarization that's causing them to open. But because of their different characteristics, the voltage-gated potassium channel opens with a delay. And then the voltage-gated sodium channel inactivates at about the peak of the action potential. That's about the same time that the voltage-gated potassium channels are opening, increasing the permeability of the membrane to potassium. And these channels will keep on popping open and close during the entire time that the membrane potential is depolarized. So this figure from the book puts this all together. Okay. So this is 410 from the old edition. I don't know if it's still 410, something close to that. And so what you have here is you have the action potential waveform, analog wave, right? And then below that you have the current flow through voltage-gated sodium channels individually. So that would be one channel, another channel, another channel. Okay. So those are channels that are open during the rising phase, okay, and inactivating. And this shows the current flow through all of those channels cumulatively. So that's the flux of sodium in, and that's the cumulative flux of sodium in through all of the voltage-gated sodium channels, right? That's producing this rising phase of the action potential. And then below that, time locked with the action potential. So this is not a clamp now. This is trying to show what's going on during the action potential itself. What you have during and what's causing the falling phase is you have here voltage-gated potassium channels. You see they're not opening as quickly as the voltage-gated sodium channels, right? So they're open with a delay, and they stay open, they continue to open and close repeatedly versus a single opening for the voltage-gated sodium channels. And it is through the mass of these voltage-gated potassium channels that you have the efflux of potassium. And so this is basically showing the current, all of the potassium that's flowing through all of the open voltage-gated potassium channels. And then this final figure just puts it all together. That's the sodium influx, that's the potassium efflux. Okay? In relationship to the action potential itself. Right? Pretty cool. Yes?
What causes the sodium to be down and the potassium to be up?
So what causes the sodium, what causes the waveform?
Yeah.
The waveform is a function largely of the number of voltage-gated sodium channels that are open. Okay? And the proximity to the equilibrium potential. So as the membrane potential gets closer to the equilibrium potential for sodium, there's going to be a slower rate of influx of sodium. So it's two things. One is the pathways that sodium has to get into the neuron, and the other is the pressure, if you will, from the difference of the voltage from the equilibrium potential of that ion. Not simple stuff. Yeah.
Why do the channels open and close repeatedly?
That's just a characteristic that they have. So they open and close repeatedly because they are themselves have the depolarization produces a force on them. Like, now they could say open constantly, but they don't. Now why they pop open and close, that part I don't really know. And they don't both have an activation mechanism, so they keep on doing it. I can't answer that question in detail. Questions? Okay, let's go on to the next step here. And the overarching theme now is conduction velocity. But embedded within that overarching theme of conduction velocity, there are lots of kind of conceptual get it points. Things that should help you conceptualize the action potential in a more dynamic form as it's flowing along the axon. Okay? So the diagram here, the blue part, the cylinder, is meant to represent an axon. And everything else, well, not everything else, everything else is essentially trying to represent what's going on in different portions of the axon at different points during an action potential. Okay, and so this is a single point in time. And here you have above the axon, I'm representing the voltage change during an action potential. So this would be an action potential that's traveling in this direction, right? From the axon hillock over here that's not shown toward the presynaptic terminal down here, also not shown. So this is the direction of travel. So of course, the first thing that's happening in an action potential is you have the rising phase, then you have the peak, and then you have the falling phase, and then the undershoot, then back to rest. Okay? And then below it, within the axon itself, I'm trying to show with arrows the flux of sodium and potassium. And so during the rising phase, you have the high permeability of the membrane, and now you can see membrane. You have a high permeability during the rising phase. You have a high permeability of the axon to sodium, and so sodium flows down its electrical gradient from outside of the neuron to inside. That is what's causing this depolarization. And just as a preview of conduction velocity, is the flux of the positively charged ions, mostly sodium, flowing ahead of this rising phase that is causing the action potential conduction, the factors that are in action potential conduction velocity. And the preview, and I'll go back over this in more detail because it takes circling around, okay? So there is this sodium flowing in, right, from 360 degrees around the cylinder of the axon through the open voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium flowing in, and it will both diffuse and be propelled away from that site. So diffusion, you know, right, because there's a higher concentration of sodium, but these are positively charged ions that repel each other. And so these positively charged ions are also propelled down the axon. Now they're propelled in both directions, but I'm only showing one for convenience. I'm only showing them be propelled this way for convenience. So whatever increases the concentration of these positively charged ions, the distance they travel, or rapidly they travel in front of the rising phase of the action potential is what increases the conduction velocity. Okay? And the reason that those factors increase conduction velocity is because this wave of depolarization ahead of the rising phase will cause depolarization that opens voltage-gated sodium channels. Anything that does that more rapidly is going to increase the conduction velocity. Okay, but let me go, that's the big theme, but let me go to some of the smaller themes too, okay? So you've got the rising phase. The rising phase is caused by this influx of positively charged sodium, okay? Then you get the inactivation gate. So in this portion of, actually, I said that wrong. In this portion of the axon here, during the falling phase, the voltage-gated sodium channels in that location of the membrane are inactivated. Can't get sodium to come in. Okay? But at this peak, you have this action potential, you have the opening of the voltage-gated potassium channels, allowing potassium to flow down their electrochemical gradient, which is from inside to outside, making the membrane potential more negative. That's what's causing more negative falling phase here. And a fair number of these voltage-gated potassium channels are open here, which drives the membrane potential close to -80, close to the equilibrium potential for potassium. That's putting the whole thing together. Now, what's confusing some students, a lot of you just go, yeah, sure, of course, get it, right? What's confusing some of the students is why this action potential backwards? Well, it isn't, right? This action potential is just traveling happily down the axon, frozen in time. And so this would be like you took a snapshot of the axon at one time, and then a millisecond later, this same traveling wave would be further here. So if I could draw it, instead of drawing, you have like that. And then later in time, another millisecond, it would be down there, and so on and so forth. So the graphs that you've been shown before are voltage as a function of time. As though you had an electrode right here at the beginning, right? One electrode in one location, measuring over time the wave as it passes that point. And so when you graph it that way, the first thing that shows up in the graph, that is on the left side of the graph, is this depolarization, which is on the right side of this figure. So it's just a different way of representing the same thing. Here you have the voltage at one time in different locations. The typical graphs that you've seen before this are the voltage at one location over time. Differences displaying the same data. Okay, and you need to integrate those two forms. So even after class, we can go talk about it. I can use some analogies to help with that. Okay. So clarification questions on anything I've said so far. So back to conduction velocity. That's the overarching theme here. Back to conduction velocity. So what are the factors that will increase the rate, the concentration, etc., of these positively charged ions in front of the rising phase of the action potential? Well, as I said before, the reason that wave of depolarization is important is because that's the voltage, that's the depolarization that is opening the voltage-gated sodium channels. So the faster the voltage-gated sodium channels open ahead of this rising phase, the more sodium will flow in, more depolarization, more voltage-gated channels open, more sodium flows in, more depolarization, so on and so forth. Right? So anything that increases the rate of this travel is going to increase conduction velocity. So there are two major factors that can do that. The two major ways of increasing conduction velocity. One is to decrease the internal resistance. So anything that makes it easier, right, you decrease the internal resistance of these ions traveling, that will increase conduction velocity. So how do you decrease the internal resistance to the flow of these ions? And that's very simple. You make a bigger axon. The larger the diameter of the axon, the less the internal resistance, the more rapidly these charged ions can flow ahead of the rising phase, the faster the action potential conduction velocity. Questions? But I repeat that part. So yeah, so the question is, what changes conduction velocity? Or simply, how is conduction velocity increased? And what's increasing conduction velocity is anything that's causing more of the voltage-gated sodium channels to open more rapidly ahead of the rising phase, because that will allow more sodium to flow in. And so what is opening the voltage-gated sodium channels ahead of the rising phase is the sodium that's fluxed in through the open voltage-gated sodium channels, and it is diffusing away from the point of entry, as well as being propelled away from the point of entry, because these positively charged ions don't like being close to each other, they repel each other. So they're being projected down. Okay, so there's some internal resistance, right? There's an intracellular fluid here. There's resistance to the flow of these charged ions. And one of the ways that you can make more of them get further down the axon faster is by decreasing that resistance. And the easy way of doing that is to make a larger diameter axon. So the analogy in the book is a water hose. You get a little water hose, little narrow water hose. It's hard to push water through rapidly. You get a giant hose, it's really, the water will flow more rapidly at a faster rate too, not just a larger volume. Same idea here. Okay. And so there's a certain kind of creature that uses this approach, which is actually physiologically important, to increase conduction velocity, and those are the invertebrates, the critters without backbones. And so in the extreme version, there are some of these invertebrates that actually have axon diameters of 1 millimeter. That is colossally large. So large that when they were first discovered, it was accidentally and incorrectly thought that they were actually blood vessels. So this is the squid giant axon. And much of what we know now about action potentials was discovered back in the late 40s, early 1950s by studying the squid giant axon with a diameter of 1 millimeter, larger than the lead of a pencil. Humongous. By contrast, there are very few axons in humans and mammals and vertebrates that have diameters of over 10 microns, 1/100th of the size of the squid giant axon. So what's the conduction velocity of an axon? What's the conduction velocity of an action potential in the squid giant axon? 20 meters per second. We're not talking speed of light here, 20 meters per second. So what does that look like in real life? 20 meters, roughly 20 yards, football field, 100 yards, roughly 100 meters. An action potential beginning at one end zone in the squid giant axon. They're none of them that are 100 meters long. They're big, but they're not that big. If you had a squid giant axon that went from one end zone to another, an action potential starting at one end zone would take 5 seconds to get to the other end zone. That's the fastest travel of action potentials known in invertebrates. Not so quick. You can probably fight faster than that. Okay, so that's one mechanism. Any questions about that one? Then there's a better way. Or faster way. The other way of increasing the concentration, this one's harder to understand conceptually, typically. The other way of increasing conduction velocity is to increase membrane resistance. So one of the things that is not shown here, one of the things is as you have this traveling wave of passively charged ions as part of the rising phase, some of those ions are escaping through the membrane. And the more of them that escape, the lower the concentration that travels ahead of the rising phase, and the less the depolarization that travels in front of the rising phase. So anything that will trap more of these ions within the membrane will increase conduction velocity because of increasing their concentration. Right? So you trap. Yeah, I can do this with shadow, but there's no projection anymore. You're trapping the ions within the membrane, that increases conduction velocity. How does that happen? Remember the oligodendrocytes back in chapter 2 lectures ago, right? And so what happens is that if this represents an axon, right, the squid giant axon is not myelinated. Big, it's thick. Action potentials travel at 20 meters per second in that 1 millimeter thick axon. But in the much smaller axons that exist in vertebrates, what you have are myelination, you have the oligodendrocytes, and the oligodendrocytes will spiral around the axon tightly, trapping the ions inside. That increases action potential conduction velocity to an even greater extent. So here you have a neuron, axon. This is myelinated. You have 3 oligodendrocytes. Okay, this is why you read the book, because I can't draw that well. Right. So here you have a cross section of one of the oligodendrocytes. That's the axon, and the membrane of the oligodendrocyte literally spirals around tightly. And myelinated axons are white, and the reason that they look white is because in this spiraling around the lipid bilayer, it's the lipid bilayer. So the reason that the fibrotract, the reason that the corpus callosum, you've seen that, right, is white as compared to the other areas, is because of the amount of fat in these oligodendrocytes, because basically the cytoplasm is squeezed out in these spirals, and so you just have these spirals of lipid bilayer. It's the lipid within the bilayer that causes the fibrotracts to be white. That's the myelination. And so basically what happens here is that you have an action potential that's initiated at the axon hillock. There's an influx of ions, mostly sodium, but other ions as well, but let me just keep it simple. It's sodium. The sodium ions will flow down, trapped inside, flowing rapidly down under the oligodendrocyte to a node of Ranvier, and there you have a concentration of voltage-gated sodium and voltage-gated potassium channels. And basically, you get the action potential recharge, starting over again. Sodium flows in, travels down under the oligodendrocyte to the next node of Ranvier, regenerating the action potential. So here, what you have is what's called saltatory conduction, literally skipping conduction, where technically the action potential really only exists at the nodes of Ranvier. So you have an action potential here, you have an action potential there, you have an action potential there, you have an action potential there. Right? Because underneath the oligodendrocytes, the axonal membrane underneath the oligodendrocytes has very few voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels, which are a defining feature of action potential. So you have the action potential basically skipping, that's the saltatory conduction, skipping from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. The reason that they travel faster is, again, because so much of the sodium that flows in through any particular node of Ranvier is trapped within the axon and therefore is projected rapidly toward the next node of RON-VA, where it will open the voltage-gated sodium channels that exist there. Okay? And so this is a much more rapid form of action potential conduction. How fast? Well, about 5 times faster. About 5 times faster. So in a myelinated axon, and most of which exists in you and me, not all of our axons are myelinated, we have unmyelinated axons as well. But in a myelinated axon, even though the diameter may only be 1/100th of the squid giant axon, it has action potential conduction velocities of 100 meters per second, the fastest known. So there, if you had a myelinated axon from one end zone to another at 100 meters per second, instead of taking 5 seconds to travel from one end zone to another, it would take 1 second to travel from one end zone to another. Still, we're not talking speed of light here. That's not so fast. So the rate at which action potentials travel can be rate limiting for almost everything. Speed of thought, reaction time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you had a question.
Yeah. Does having more oligodendrocytes or concepts necessarily mean it's faster? So that the number you have on the axon is that
No. So the question was, does having more oligodendrocytes mean that the action potential travels faster? No. And the converse of the question that you just asked is, why, if oligodendrocytes are such a marvelous approach to increasing action potential conduction velocity, is not the entire axon ensheathed by a single oligodendrocyte? Why is it that you need nodes of RON-VA in the first place? And the answer to that, and if I end up not answering your question, just go, well, what I really want to know is that, okay? So the question is, why not have a single oligodendrocyte that ensheaths the entire axon? Well, one reason is because some of these axons are a meter long. But that aside, what happens is that if you could measure the voltage at different minuscule points along the oligodendrocyte, the concentration of sodium that flows in, well, let me go here. The concentration of sodium that flows in here would decline as you travel further and further through the next node of RON-VA. So even though the sodium is largely trapped by the oligodendrocyte, still, from the point of entry at one node of RON-VA, there's going to be a progressive decline in the concentration of that sodium as it travels further from the point of node of RON-VA down the oligodendrocyte. If the oligodendrocytes were really, really long, there would not be enough of the sodium reaching the next node of RON-VA to cause the polarization to threshold. So the reason that there are multiple, the reason that the entire axon is ensheathed is you need nodes of RON-VA to recharge the axon, to recharge the action potential. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Good question.
Sorry, as a follow-up question, so instead of going lengthwise now, what about like volume-wise? If you have more, like if you make that diameter thicker of the oligodendrocyte, like if you have like more rolls,
right?
Does that make sense?
So the question is, the more, is it the case that the more that the myelin spirals around the axon, the greater the membrane resistance? I don't know that that's ever been measured. I would assume so. Right, so there's a measurement question, there's a data question. It may have been done that I don't know about, but I don't know the answer to that for sure. I know that it doesn't make sense to have any more of those spirals than you need because it takes space. And that's going to limit the number of neurons, the number of axons that you can have, right? So there is a space limiting capacity of the skull and of the brain. Space is important. You want as much processing power as possible within the minimum amount of space. Trade-off there. Questions? Yes?
Does the conduction velocity increase if the temperature increases?
Does the conduction, the conduction velocity is increased by temperature. Yes. And so, one of the presumed advantages of being a so-called warm-blooded animal is that the computational and processing power of our nervous system doesn't change dramatically with different temperatures. There are animals that live in very different temperatures that don't regulate their own body temperature, and their ability to process information and the reaction times will vary dramatically with temperature. You see animals that are near freezing at that point. Sometimes you can pick predatory snakes up, and I wouldn't try myself, but and that's largely because of the slowdown action potential induction and other synaptic potentials and everything else is going on. Yes, it's temperature dependent.
I think it's all we do is hold traps of sodium, which helps it pressure. Is all we do is also create pressure that also sees that
Well, they do increase pressure because they actually squeeze the axon. So we say that the axon diameter is constant, and functionally that's reasonably true, but actually the oligodendrocytes wrap so tightly around the axon that they decrease the diameter and you actually get them bulging out at the node of the bronze gate. I forgot what your actual question was.
So I was just wondering if it's a combination of the pressure of the oligodendrocytes and the trapping of the sodium or the trapping.
Inevitably, there has to be a relationship between the seal that the oligodendrocytes are forming around the axon and the trapping of the ion. So I'd say yes. I don't know any data on that particular thing. I'm just assuming from what I know about physics that that's the case. Question? Yes. Does the conduction velocity increase with the number of nodes of Ranvier? There's a different way of looking at it. I'm not going to answer the question because I don't know for sure. Right? I think give me a minute or two to compute, I can probably answer that one for sure. But what's important is that there's a safety factor. And so in the distance of the nodes of Ranvier, there's actually a calculable, not all oligodendrocytes are the same length. There's a relationship between the diameter of the axon and the length of the oligodendrocyte. And it's been calculated that there's what the safety factor is from node Ranvier to node Ranvier. And it's such that the safety factor tends to be about the same across different axonal diameters and thus different lengths of oligodendrocytes. Does that make sense? It wasn't your question, but I thought I'd throw something else in anyway. Let's see. Let me go on to get the last thing in action potentials. Finish it up. Okay? And then we can go on to synaptic potentials today. No, it's not the last thing. Rats. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to finish action potentials today, but what I will want to do is I want to go back to membrane pumps. So I talked back, we were talking about resting membrane potential, about ion pumps, very, very briefly. And the only question then is, well, okay, you've got this concentration of potassium, which is 100 millimoles inside, 5 out, and then you've got the concentration of sodium, that's 150 out, 50 in. How were those initially established? And the answer was ion pumps. Well, you have, with action potentials, you have an influx of sodium and you have an efflux of potassium. And even though the flux of those ions to produce a single action potential doesn't appreciably change the concentration gradient, eventually, after tens or hundreds or thousands, depending upon the size of the neuron, after a number of action potentials, eventually the concentration gradients will begin to decline. And so not only does the ion pumps establish the original concentrations of these ions, they also reestablish them during the action potential. Okay, and so this is just a kind of conceptual diagram of the sodium potassium pump in this case. So here, this is the membrane. This is an enzyme. I'll go see it's a little bit simplified. Okay, and so there are a variety of these, right? So this one's a sodium potassium pump. There are also calcium pumps and pumps for a variety of different ions. Okay, so in this particular case, you have a pump that will pump 2 ions of potassium in for every 3 ions of sodium that are pumped out. In terms of instead of memorizing it, which direction are things pumped, just remember it's opposite from the direction that ions travel during the action potential, right? Because this is normalizing the concentration gradient after a number of action potentials. Okay. Now, one of the factors about this is that this is an electrogenic pump because there's an unequal number of positive ions pumped in and out. With activation of this pump, it alone will change membrane potential. Okay? So sometimes, independently of action potentials, there are factors that can influence the activity of these pumps, right? There's the second messengers and all kind of intracellular messengers. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, right? So anytime these pumps are turned on, anytime a pump that will pump 3 out to 2 in, that's electrogenic, is going to change membrane potential. That's just something to keep in mind for later, okay? And so what actually are these pumps sensing? The sodium-potassium pump sense the intracellular concentration of sodium, right? So this is intracellular. And as the intracellular concentration of sodium increases, that will increase the rate at which the sodium-potassium pumps are active. Okay? That's the main sensing mechanism. And these are exquisitely sensitive. The smallest changes in intracellular sodium concentrations will change the rate of the pump's activation. The smallest increase will increase the rate of these pumps act. The other thing, and the last point I want to make, and also one of the most important, is that these are very highly energy dependent. These are major users of ATP, the cellular metabolic currency. It's been calculated, and I mentioned this earlier, it's been calculated that of all of the energy used by the brain, roughly 70% goes to drive these ion pumps. Not just this kind, all of the ion pumps that establish all the ion gradients that allow neurons to operate. 70%. The brain is the most metabolically active tissue in the body by a long shot. So even though your brain may only be 2% of your entire body weight, more or less, depending on body weight and a few other things, it's been calculated that the amount of the calories that you eat every day, 20 to 25% go to drive metabolic activity of the brain. So about 20% of the calories you eat every day go to drive these pumps. So that also emphasizes the other importance of myelination, right? Because with myelination, you decrease the amount of sodium-potassium flux necessary for an action potential starting at the axon hillock to get to the point where it releases the transmitter. And that's actually probably more important. That decrease in the metabolic demands that due to myelination is probably more important than the increase in action potential conduction velocity. That's the bottom line. I'll trip quickly over this next time and finish up action potentials and really get into synaptic potentials next lecture. And I'll also spend some time outside.